I think that's important. And I went on a family holiday, and then with my cousin, he's quite a bit younger than me, and his girlfriend, he wanted to go on this like bouldering walk. And I wasn't quite sure if it's going to be for me. And I was like, oh, I'll give it a go. And I've got a horrible fear of heights, like really significant. We weren't even going from a particular height, but we had to jump into these like wild streams. And then at one point we did a really small abseil, and I felt really stressed in my body, but I was like, God, it's so nice to be stressed about something that's actually in my mind a danger, rather than it just being thoughts that have created the adrenaline. I thought that was quite funny.
Well, illusionary stresses.
Yeah, the illusionary stresses. Isn't that
It's a thing. Welcome back to episode 4 of Her Daily Rhythm, the podcast dedicated to empowering you to live in harmony with your mind, body, and spirit. I'm Natalie Smyth, your host, guiding you on this journey with FemVid, a holistic wellness platform for women from menstruation to menopause, making health management easy and stress-free. In this episode, we talk with Marjolein Dutry Van Haften, a registered nutritional therapist specialising in women's health, about her personal journey from burnout to becoming an advocate for women's health. She shares insights gained from her struggles with endometriosis, chronic fatigue, and the importance of a balanced gut microbiome for hormonal health. We also discuss the impact of stress on the body, the benefits of retreats for the nervous system, and her use of food-first approaches and targeted functional testing to address chronic health conditions. Marilyanne is a registered nutritional therapist with a focus on women's health, who has been working in the health and wellness industry since 2015. After experiencing burnout in her 20s and going on to discover that long-term symptoms that had been deemed insignificant from a previous doctor were in fact a chronic health condition. Marilyanne's mission is to make sure that women know that there is always another way to support your health and improve your symptoms. Since qualifying as a nutritional therapist in 2018, Marilyanne has helped hundreds of women globally to transform their health and their relationship with food and their bodies through bespoke nutrition and lifestyle programs based on comprehensive lab testing. Marilyanne also hosts a retreat annually in Portugal, which provides a space for clients to truly rest and recalibrate their nervous system and feel truly supported. Marilyanne is passionate about influencing change in the approach to women's health, deconstructing the shame women feel about their bodies and their symptoms, and educating on what is normal so that they can push for further support if being dismissed by their medical practitioner. This stems from personal experiences of seeking help from the GP for debilitating symptoms of period pain at the age of 16 and not receiving a diagnosis of endometriosis until 14 years later. Marilyanne has been featured as an expert in Stylist and in the Movement magazine, provides consultancy for wellness businesses, and is an event host and speaker. This is a juicy episode, so tune in and learn more about managing stress, the relationship between gut health and hormones, and strategies for achieving optimal wellness. Wow. Welcome, Marilyanne. That is an incredible accolade of achievements, both personal, and it sounds like you are on a mission through your own journey. So I would love for you to expand on that, because your story is definitely not uncommon.
Thanks so much. I was actually speaking to prospective students at the college where I qualified back in 2018 at the weekend. And so I've reflected on this quite a lot. And quite a few people did say that they resonated. Essentially, I was in my 20s, and I think the moment where it really crystallized for me that things weren't normal was I was walking home from the supermarket, and it was a 10-minute walk. And I hadn't even bought that much stuff. It was a very reasonable shop. I had to stop and wait and rest on my neighbour's garden wall because I was just so exhausted. And I went to the GP, and I was lucky. They did run some tests, but they just told me everything was fine. And I just had all of these issues with debilitating mood symptoms, fatigue. I was getting repeat infections as well. So I ended up being sent to a kidney specialist because I'd had 2 kidney infections in a year. And it was only a few years later, once I'd actually started studying, that I could look back and realized that it was burnout and my adrenals were just completely frazzled. And I didn't know where to turn for support. And so my mission now is to make sure that nobody feels as lonely as I did in their healing journey. My goal is to partner with my clients to help them advocate for themselves and really improve their symptoms and their quality of life, especially if they've got an underlying chronic health condition that no one has helped them with, which was the case with me.
So you had this debilitating pain, you were fatigued, burnout, you went to the doctor. Obviously, the labs are only for a diagnosis and you can't really diagnose that. So what inspired you to go deeper, or how did you go deeper? And then from being in this state of burnout, how did you go into studying this? Because it's not usually that everybody's next action.
No, and actually I think that kind of demonstrates how I got to where I was. One of my biggest weaknesses is I'll just do it myself. I'll just figure it out myself. And actually, one of the biggest things that I work on now with clients and just generally when I'm speaking to groups of people is, and we touched on it earlier, is this sense of community and being part of something and knowing that there are other people out there who can support you. So when I went to go and see the GP and I had the blood tests and they said, everything looks fine. And I went to the kidney specialist and they said, structurally, nothing's wrong with you, which to a degree is a relief. But then you think, well, what now? And I did have a conversation with the nephrologist, the kidney specialist, who had looked on my notes and said, oh, I noticed that you've got IBS. You need to sort that out before this problem will correct itself. And I thought, okay, so for 5 years now, I've been trying to sort out my IBS and I've not got anywhere. So again, it was a clue, but I wasn't quite sure where to go with that. And somebody recommended that I go and see a nutritional therapist. And I thought, I have nothing to lose at this point. I'm really keen to feel better. That was my only goal. I didn't even want to get to the point that I had been previously. I just wanted to feel a little bit better. And I saw somebody and saw a really significant improvement in my symptoms, but then they plateaued again. And I thought, okay, there's more here. I really want to understand this modality better. So I looked into where I could study and I picked a place in London called the Institute for Optimum Nutrition. What I will say now is, with hindsight, probably would have been better off waiting for at least 3 to 6 months and as really nourishing my adrenal glands for a little bit longer. Because when you're very burnt out, taking on a 3.5-year course, it's not really, I don't think you'd recommend it to your clients, would you, Natalie?
Absolutely not. So but I suppose this is the thing, is we're coming to a place maybe as women, or you experience IBS. Again, it's asymptomatic. People are desperate and we need solutions, and there's no clear pathway, and everything needs to change for that. And when you are desperate, you get a little snippet that, oh, I do feel better. And wow, there's a possibility of feeling better, isn't there? When you realize, oh, the way that I've been feeling for 10 years is really not great or normal. Wow.
That currency of hope. I think it's the hope is the most important thing, because as we know, your mindset is so incredibly powerful. And if you think there's a possibility of a different outcome, that creates so much space and it opens so many doors.
So what was the biggest takeaway when you were studying? And whilst you were studying, you were your own patient, I can imagine. But with that, when you're your own patient and you're studying, the experimentation can also go the other way too.
Oh gosh, that's where I really got into my love of functional testing. I find it so fascinating. I don't think it's a panacea solve all, but for some people, seeing what is going on in their body at that particular time and getting a much broader picture and being able to connect that to their symptoms is just incredible. So yes, I 100% was a guinea pig. I have reams of test results of things that I put myself through, which was fascinating. But my biggest takeaway, my mind being blown, was when I was sitting in the women's health lecture and I hear all of these symptoms that I had passed off as normal and been told as a teenager, some women just have that. And it was debilitating pain, fainting around your periods, vomiting, nausea, these sweating episodes. And I thought, oh, that sounds familiar. And I thought, okay, there is something going on. And that was when I connected that what was probably happening to me was endometriosis. And so I ended up getting a diagnosis privately, because at that point I'd lost a lot of trust. I'd convinced myself for many years that I was less than others, because if everyone has periods, but not everyone suffers so badly, there must be something wrong with me. I'm the problem, in the words of Taylor Swift. That was the moment for me that I thought, oh, okay, this is it. This is what's going on for me. So I got my diagnosis, and that's really what crystallized my passion to focus on these health issues that we see a lot. So endometriosis, polycystic ovarian syndrome, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, the ones that just get swept under the rug and you're told, oh, just take this until you want to have a baby. But what happens if that moment doesn't come? Do I not deserve to investigate what's happening in my body now and to feel better now? So that was my real takeaway while studying, was that moment where I realized I'd been brushed off for so many years and that I didn't want other people to have the same experience.
What were your first periods like? Was it always like this, even going through school and so forth, or it progressively got worse as higher stress were increased and lifestyle changes and living in London and so forth, all that is required?
So I had my first period when I was 14, and I didn't have any significant symptoms. I remember really clearly it was at 16 that I had my first really crippling period, and I was due to go to a party. And I remember being incredibly disappointed that I was missing this birthday party of a friend, and it was going to be so cool and so fun. And I was completely laid up in bed. I was thrown up into a bucket and absolutely debilitated by pain. And my dad was really worried. And my mum, who obviously had periods, was a lot less concerned and just said, it's just period pain. But that was the first one that really floored me. And then for me, it wasn't every single cycle that it happened. So it was quite unpredictable. And possibly that's why I'd not really continued pushing for a diagnosis after that first episode. But I remember there were a few really clear moments, and they're always the ones where I ended up fainting in public. So one time at the dentist, one time at a bus stop in Clerkenwell, one time at a gig at Wembley. And these are obviously the moments where my memory has created something permanent, because I was not in a safe place. I was out in public. I wasn't at home. I'd completely normalized it. It was something that until 2018, I just didn't know if I was going to be able to function around the first 2 days of my periods. And there was no progression per se. And it was very unpredictable. Then, as soon as I learned about the condition, I went and saw somebody who specialized and got some really targeted recommendations, then managed it through lifestyle and didn't need to take painkillers for years after that. And then with the stress of COVID, the pain has started returning. But again, it's something now that it's very in line with stress for me. And that is my biggest weakness, is my stress management.
And so would you say that individuals with endometriosis finding what their stressor is, because it can all manifest differently for each individual?
I do think that's important. I think actually that's important for all my clients. But for endometriosis in particular, the way I approach it is we look at all the different families of stressors. So psychological, emotional, physical, so pain or surgeries, and physiological, so what's going on in the body that is driving a stress response that you may not be aware of. So it's things with the physiological side. We're looking at hydration, we're looking at nutrition levels, and we are looking at the microbiome, because often that is a really big site of physiological stress for the body, especially if we've got lots of inflammatory things going on.
Okay, so let's go back now. So you've spoken about IBS, you've spoken about the microbiome, and we're talking about hormones, and people don't know that they're all connected. So let's lean in, and this is going to be a juicy topic. Can you talk about the relationship between your microbiome, your gut, and your hormones?
So we're assuming that we've talked about the hormone cycle and the fluctuations, because I know that's a topic that you've got into already. But a really important thing that we need to remember is that we have to be able to, when the hormones are used up, get them out of the body in a safe and efficient way. And so that's when we think about the interplay of the liver and the microbiome. So there are a lot of bacteria in the gut that can either help or hinder those hormones to be safely packaged up and to get out of the gut and out of body. And if we have a lot of issues with an imbalance of bacteria, we can see hormones being recirculated, and that confuses the feedback systems in the body. So if our body is trying to decide what needs to be made at a certain time, it looks at what is already there. If our gut is recirculating a lot of estrogen, for example, then that may affect production and things like that.
And can you highlight what would make your body recycle estrogen?
Yes. So if we've got particular bacteria present, they have a byproduct, which is an enzyme. And that enzyme can uncouple estrogen from the stool. So what I mean by that is, if estrogen has been used in the body and the liver has processed it and it's ready to leave the body, it gets packaged up with bile, and it forms part of your stool. So your bowel movement, your poo. And then that is moved through the digestive tract and out of the body. But if we have a lot of bacteria present that produce this enzyme, then it can uncouple that estrogen that was bound up before, and that can be reabsorbed into the body and recirculate. So that's one thing that can affect our hormone levels. We've also got issues with, if we've got a lot of inflammatory bacteria. So the majority of our bacteria are there to live together with us in harmony, symbiotically. We help them, they help us. But sometimes we've got an overgrowth of less helpful bacteria, which can drive up inflammation. So that is when our immune system starts to get involved and gets a bit fiery. And if we've got a source of inflammation in the gut, then for us as women, we then end up with upregulated testosterone. And that can also affect our hormone health. So for anyone that's got polycystic ovarian syndrome, or they suspect that they do, these higher levels of testosterone and other androgens counter the symptoms of. So inflammation from gut is another big one that can affect our.
And how would people know that they have inflammation in the gut, for example?
So I would look at the digestive symptoms. When I speak to people on an initial call, I will always ask, do you have regular bowel movement? If you have constipation, you're not having at least 1 or 2 bowel movements a day, then that could be affecting your hormones, because that's another scenario where you're more likely to have estrogen uncoupled and recirculate. So constipation is one symptom. Bloating and discomfort. So bloating and cramping around bowel movements, or lots of gas, things like that. Those could be symptoms that there's some sort of imbalance in the gut that we want to look at. We've also got, for example, reflux. So if you have issues with food repeating on you and things like that, that's another sign that there could be an imbalance, but in a slightly different part of the digestive system.
And knowing about the balance between, always symbiote, as you say, it's a relationship between your fungi, bacteria, good, bad. There's no good, bad. It's just about the balance. What are you seeing with people coming to you with hormonal issues? In the lab testing, what are you noticing with the imbalance of bad bacteria?
So very often there's a real low presence of beneficial or commensal bacteria. So those are the ones that we expect to see. And when they take up a lot of real estate, they are supporting our digestion, supporting our immune system, producing kind of beneficial compounds as well, like vitamins and minerals and things like that. So in the less helpful side of the bacteria, we've got particular strains that are pushing up this enzyme that can recirculate estrogen, so pushing up the beta-glucuronidase enzyme. We also have issues with a family of bacteria that we call gram-negative, and gram-negative refers to their cell wall. So the issue with gram-negative bacteria is that they have little compounds that break off, and they can activate our immune system. So they have these little compounds called LPS, or lipopolysaccharides, and they can set off these immune cascades, these inflammatory cascades in the body. And so often what I'm looking for in a gut test is I want to see what someone's digestive function is doing. So are they actually breaking things down? Because if they're not, then that's lots of food for problematic bacteria to feed on. I'm looking at signs that they have a healthy gut wall, or if their gut wall is compromised, and that ties into the LPS picture. I'm looking for these bacteria that have the byproduct of beta-glucuronidase, and I'm looking at this gram-negative load to see if you've got lots of LPS. And if you have lots of LPS producers and you have a compromised gut wall, then we know that it's very likely that you've got this issue of what we call where these products are passing through the gut wall and into your circulatory system and affecting the other systems in your body.
And the symptoms of that, of what an individual will be experiencing, is exactly what you spoke about: bloating, maybe heavy or lighter periods, pain, headaches as well.
Yeah, I would say mood. I want to bring kind of mood symptoms into it as well. And that's a really big one for endometriosis as well. And actually PCOS, because if our hormones are not doing what they should be doing, we tend to have mood symptoms. But if we've got a lot of inflammatory things passing into our bloodstream, it can have an effect on brain health and therefore mood. And so there is this theory of depression that looks at inflammatory cytokines in the body. And so I would say mood symptoms can be a big one, and also brain fog. So if you're having a lot of brain fog and you've got these digestive symptoms that are possibly new, or you've just normalized them because you've had them for so long, it's worth connecting the dots in your body, because as we know, nothing in the body exists in isolation. And so figuring out how things all fit together just gives you more power in your decisions and kind of lifestyle interventions.
I think that's a really important piece for our listeners, is exactly that. We think it's a hormone issue, or we think it's a mental health issue or a stress issue. But as Marilyanne has just highlighted, your bacteria starts in your gut, but it's affecting your whole system through your inflammatory cascade, your immune system, which goes through your gut up to your brain, through your liver, through to your skin as well. And so if somebody is struggling just with normal day-to-day, what we commonly see, or what we've considered the norm is, okay, I'm always going to be bloated. My skin is always going to be a bit shabby. I need a coffee to keep going. I'm really fatigued. I have anxiety. So all of these things is, I think, what everybody has, right? And so we've accepted it as normal, but it's actually not normal. What would be your advice with this symptomology? They're probably not thinking about testing, because functional testing, private testing is a cost. Maybe people haven't even started taking supplements, or they know that they need to take probiotics, and they know they need to take omegas and magnesium again. But a normal person, probably around 28, who's experiencing that symptomology, what would you say the first thing that they do before it gets worse, to your 2018 scenario?
Yeah. My health stuff all cropped up at 27, actually. So that was an interesting that you've chosen there. First things first, we really want to think about the mechanics of digestion. So by that, I'm thinking chewing, how much stomach acid you're producing, things like that, because everything that we've described and those symptoms are all going to be exacerbated and worsened by stress. And so when we are very stressed, we downregulate lots of other processes in the body, and digestion is one of the big ones. By focusing on the mechanics, what we're then doing is we're making sure that things are actually being broken down into constituent parts that the body needs to use. If we're not doing that, then what's happening is you've got undigested food that's passing into the small intestine, and that provides the food source for bacteria that wouldn't normally feed there. And so we see this overgrowth starting higher up in the gut. And that can then drive lots and lots of symptoms that are really problematic. What we also want to think about, what are we feeding our microbiome? So the biggest thing that we can do for our microbiome is make sure that we are supporting the beneficial bacteria that's already there. And so fiber is one of the most important things. And most of us don't eat anywhere near enough fiber. We've seen that actually come out in the press a lot recently over here in the UK. We're supposed to be aiming for 25 to 30 grams a day. And I think the average is 18 grams a day. And I have a client who I spoke to the other day, and we did a little fiber audit. And some days are great and she's hitting the high 20s. And then other days it was sub 10. So there's this huge discrepancy. And fiber is like fertilizer for your gut bacteria. So it's really what it needs to thrive. And for people who are really sensitive to fiber, what that tends to mean is that there's already an imbalance. And so what I would then suggest is keep up with the fiber, but at much smaller portions, and then slowly increase your tolerance to it, because that's going to get good results. You don't need to test for it. It's just something to stay committed to and incorporate on a regular basis.
And fiber, for some people that means like bread or potatoes. So could you break down your favorite sources of fiber?
So for me, the diversity of lots of different fibers is important. I think what we call the insoluble fibers, which is what you'd find in bread and things like that, is important. That's the kind of roughage. So for me, I can't eat gluten. So that straight away took so much fiber out of my diet. And so I have to be a lot more conscious, and I use a lot of kind of ground seeds and things like that to get that insoluble fiber. And then what we want to look at is a lot of variety of plants. So by that, vegetables, predominantly vegetables and fruit. We've got some real winners. So things like asparagus, great as a prebiotic fiber. We've got artichoke, that's another really good one. I really like the cruciferous vegetables as well, because they're really fibrous, but they also help with hormone breakdown. So they support the liver. You mentioned potatoes. So we've got that really great trick of cooking potatoes and then cooling them so that we're increasing the resistant starch content. So that's a super easy one, just cooking extra potatoes, keeping them in the fridge, and then using them the next day.
White potatoes is fine.
Yeah.
So you just cook them, leave them to rest for half an hour, keep them in the fridge, and eat them cold.
Exactly. You can reheat them. They'll still have that resistant starch content. But that's a really good one to get your fiber up. Then oats. Oats are a really good source of fiber. Figure out if you tolerate them, because some people will eat oats and they find they really don't get on with them. It might be a case of having to find if it's this imbalance of bacteria starting with a much smaller portion and slowly increasing. Or it could be that there's a bit of an issue with cross-contamination with gluten and things like that. So you may want to rule out something like celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
And so you did mention slightly if you are experiencing symptoms with taking the fiber, but for example, flatulent and so forth, which is really common for people taking brassicas, that's a sign to keep going.
Yeah. So brassica and beans tend to be the big ones that are very triggering for people, because of exactly that reason, that they can make you quite flatulent. So what I would say is massively reduce the portion size. So if you find that you're really not tolerating broccoli or cauliflower, try a much, much smaller portion. And actually, a practitioner once gave me this really good recommendation, which is make it into a soup and just have a really small portion of that, so that you've got a big Tupperware or a jar. I normally keep things in glass jars. A jar in the fridge, and then you can really slowly increase the dose by having it in a liquid form.
And then I suppose going into that energy piece, we spoke obviously about what you digest, you absorb, and that completely impacts your energy. So I'm noticing a lot of people, they say that after they eat, they always feel tired or want to take a nap. That's obviously something to look out for, isn't it?
So any sort of significant energy change after you eat is a sign that should be investigated. And I would actually normally send somebody back to their GP, so their general practitioner, their doctor, for symptoms like that. So if you eat and then you feel absolutely exhausted, like you need to take a nap, then it is a sign that your body is not regulating your glucose very well. And equally, if you're what we call hangry, so if you get very anxious or very short and irritable, and then you eat and you feel so much better, that's possibly a sign that you were hypoglycemic, so your blood sugar dropped a bit too low before. And again, if that's happening frequently, then that is something that needs to be monitored. And I would normally send somebody back to a medic to just check that's all fine.
And so with these things that you've suggested, because I know a lot of people, they know they need to take probiotics, so they go out and to Holland and Barrett, or they go to their closest pharmacy to get probiotics. What are your thoughts on that?
I love it. So I always recommend going food. If you have not got the budget to test, then going food first is going to be a much, much better approach. When we choose a probiotic, there are really particular strains in the probiotic, and we just don't know if that is what our body needs. So there are certain exceptions to this. So for example, if you have been on antibiotics, or you've had a bout of food poisoning or some sort of very clear digestive short-term illness, then a short course of probiotics without testing, I think, is probably going to be helpful. And then I would look actually at something called Saccharomyces boulardii, which is actually a yeast, because that's really beneficial to get problematic bacteria out, and it also helps to support our innate immune system. And then there are a few really general broad stroke strains of things like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria that would be helpful as a really broad stroke probiotic. But if you have a particular health condition, it's worth speaking to a practitioner to get a really specific recommendation for a probiotic, because there are certain probiotic strains that might help with skin. And there are certain probiotic strains that help with the vaginal microbiome. And we've not even touched on that, but that's another big topic. And then there are certain strains that help with, for example, people that have inflammatory bowel disease versus irritable bowel syndrome. So it's really personalized and specialized. And I don't like the idea of people taking one particular probiotic with fixed strains in it long term, indefinitely. So I definitely think long term, we're looking at food first approach here. And I much prefer, if people are looking for a supplement to support their microbiome, that they actually go for a prebiotic fiber. And again, remembering with those symptoms that we talked about, they're a bit undesirable, the farting and the bloating, start on a really small dose, like way smaller than it says on the back of the packet. But I much prefer starting with fiber and then slowly increasing, and then deciding, do we go in with a probiotic, normally based on some testing as well.
In short term. And with the probiotics, what that does is that grows your own individual bacteria for your individual biological needs too, doesn't it? I think that the thing is that we're all so different, and you experiencing completely different systems and manifestations than your friends, everybody does.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have to move away from this green pharmacy type attitude. Now, I did actually want to ask you about the vaginal microbiome too, because it's a new research, and there's a little bit of funding behind it. So can you talk about somebody has recurrent thrush, or how to prevent UTIs? I know that's definitely the specific genetic composition as well, but could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah. So the interesting thing, if we compare, so we've talked a little bit about the gut microbiome, and with the gut, the goal is lots of diversity. And then with the vaginal microbiome, the goal is really not a lack of diversity. We want really specific strains of lactobacillus present. And that's what's really protective. And it's really interesting. If somebody does have cases of recurrent thrush or something like BV, so bacterial vaginosis, very often we see it coming back at a particular point in the cycle every month. And that's because if we think about it, if we have our periods, our vaginal environment, it's a lot more iron rich. And so there's different bacteria that will thrive versus just after we ovulate and just before we get our periods, our immune function drops a little bit because the body's goal is specialisation and implantation. And so it lowers our immune system a little bit. So very often what we see is people will get this kind of recurrence of symptoms just after they ovulate and just before their cycle. And that would tie it to that dip in their immune function. Or if they're getting it during their period, it's to do with bacteria that are thriving on iron. So in terms of improving the balance, I think root cause, we want to find out why is there an imbalance? And actually this is where estrogen comes in quite a lot. So estrogen, a really estrogen-rich environment really helps lactobacillus to thrive. And so if we're getting a lot of infections, do we need to think about what are the rest of our hormones doing? And is that influencing the environment? But also, we can look at short-term probiotic use to improve the terrain, as it were. So we can look at things like lactobacillus. There's a really particular strain of lactobacillus rhamnosus that is really good for the vaginal microbiome. And there's some really great brands out there. That there's two in particular that I can think of that I recommend to clients. One of them is Optibac and the other one is In Vivo. If you're in the UK, really good vaginal microbiome probiotic. We also want to figure out, is it recurrent thrush or is it recurrent BV? Because there are slightly different approaches that we would take. And if it is thrush, for example, then do we need to think about a fungal overgrowth in the gut as well that is then translocating to the vaginal microbiome?
Does this as well fit into that piece of preventing for HPV and so forth, particularly younger?
Yes, it definitely can do. So what we want is this really robust lactobacillus rich vaginal microbiome, because that is really protective against things like HPV and other infections as well.
That's fascinating. I didn't really realize how the species would change during your cycle. Like, that is quite remarkable how quickly. And of course, it does happen like that. And it just shows how every day and every moment we're changing, and the importance of really tuning into your body, starting with digesting things slowly, because you might digest things differently one day with stress or where your mind is involved.
The impact of stress is wild. I had a client recently and we did 2 microbiome tests quite close to each other. And there was a really big stressful event coming up. And the digestive function, the drop in enzyme production was so remarkable. And just seeing that in real time was incredible. So it's really significant, the impact of stress on our digestive function, and then as a result on the microbiome.
And stress, we've gone in and out of stress in this whole conversation, but we haven't quite specifically spoken about the mechanism, how it affects your hormones and what happens. So you mentioned an incredibly stressful event, but what about just everyday city life living, family life living, emotional, mental stress? What is happening to your body, your hormones, your microbiome then?
Yes, the cumulative impact of chronic stress.
Mhm.
So we can see it when we look at somebody's adrenals, for example. So that the adrenals are responsible for producing cortisol and adrenaline, so our main stress hormones. And what we can see is that we can go through phases where we respond to a stressor. So we have a really significant response. But if we have lots of perceived stressors all the time, then sometimes we see just an elevated level of cortisol across the board. And then eventually what happens is that the body has this feedback mechanism where it says, we can't deal with high levels of cortisol all the time. That's not healthy for the body. So it downregulates everything. And that's when we start to see this burnout, like exhaustion picture. And that is what's coming back a lot, especially post-COVID. I'm seeing it a lot, we haven't really processed the stress from that. So the impact of stress on our hormones is that if our body is in a stress state, it perceives that it's not a safe environment for procreation. And so therefore it's not putting as many resources into those hormonal fluctuations that we would normally see. It's not putting as many resources into follicular health, egg health, all of those kind of things. So the resources get redirected. And from a microbiome perspective, taking it back to digestion, if resources have been diverted away from digestion, then we're seeing food not being digested as well because our digestive function, our digestive capacity reduces. And so we see a shift in the microbiome. But stress hormones themselves have an impact on the microbiome. So we can also see that lowered levels of beneficial bacteria in people reporting stress. So there is an impact in the levels of the helpful bacteria as well.
And then I think stress is something that it increases with tolerance. So for example, a lot of people, you'll ask them if they're stressed, they're not stressed, but then their labs tell them something different. So I think we now are so cut off from our body that we don't really realize we're in stress, because most people don't think they're stressed, but then you look at their labs or all of the symptoms that they've just told you, and there's that awareness piece. So I wonder if you could speak about that. We talk about stress a lot and people are maybe in denial of how it affects their biology.
Stress is so tricky. Exactly like you've just said, often people's baseline is up here. They're like, I'm not stressed, but we look and we're up here. And actually, if we compare that to in the grand scheme of things, that is stressed. And so what we do as humans is we disconnect this from the rest of the body because it becomes too difficult to manage all of the feelings. And so we stop noticing them. And when we start re-establishing that mind-body connection, which we can do through so many different ways, like mindful practices and mindful movement and connecting with nature and all of those kind of things. But when we start to reconnect those, it feels so uncomfortable in the beginning. But ultimately, for your long-term health, it's so important that you're noticing the cues from your body, because one of the things that we hear the most about is sleep disturbances and that having an impact on quality of life. But our whole body has a circadian rhythm. Our hunger cues are set by our circadian rhythm. When we go to bed, when we wake up, all of these things. And so if we've completely disconnected from our stress response, we are not living in rhythm. We've completely removed ourselves from it.
So you just mentioned those simple things. And I have noticed those people, when I do teach yoga and meditation, it's, I'm not into that. I can't do that. I've got to go punching. And it's very much that A-type personality, because there is that uncomfortability with feeling, because it's the same as if you're someone that's hyper on the go, you go on holidays and you become sick, don't you?
Yeah.
But it's that disconnection there. So I think the first pieces of helping people to connect to their bodies is going in nature, doing some breathing, kind of nervous system regulation things. Is that what you recommend?
It's exactly what I recommend. It's why I set up the retreat exactly for that, to create this space where you are really able to tap into your nervous system, but in a really safe space as well. And all of the decision making is taken away from you, because as you show up, you're brought to the space. All your meals are prepared for you. There's a program of things that you can participate in if you choose. But really, it's about that nervous system regulation.
Can you talk to us a little bit about your retreat and retreats in general? Because I think now there's a lot of awareness. They're not hippie, and it is a priority and something to do, to retreat from life so you can be taken care of.
I think that's it. It's the being taken care of. I created it because it was exactly what my clients needed. And even for the clients that don't come along, sometimes we do instill retreat mode on a protocol that they put in place at home. So that will be things like a slow morning, eating breakfast within an hour of waking, not having any caffeine on an empty stomach, connecting with nature in some way, possibly journaling if that is something that they're open to, breathing exercises. And it's scheduling these all as part of your day so that you're taking these little micro breaks away from your stress response and nourishing that nervous system. And with the retreat, it's such an opportunity to create the space for people and really help foster deep rest. Because when we live in a city, we've got artificial lights, we've got noise. I can hear the traffic, you can hear your neighbors, and your brain is constantly vigilant. Whereas if we're in this kind of safe space in nature, but we haven't had to organize it, we don't have to map read to get there, it's that logistical stress is taken away from you. It's just such an opportunity for kind of calmness and dropping into your body.
And that deservingness piece, I think as women, I notice an archetype that I don't deserve it, or you have to look after everybody. I just wanted to go back to something that you mentioned. We have hormesis with biohacking and things like that. So stressing the body, which is a stress, but a stressor can be good for your body. But I know there's fasting principles and ice cold therapies and sauna and HIIT that. What have you seen in women who participate in these practices? Do you suggest them as well?
I'm so glad you brought that up because I know that they're so trendy, but you have to get the basics in place before you can biohack anything. So many people don't have the basics in place. If you're not sleeping, you're not chewing your food, you're not providing enough time to rest, you're not taking downtime before sleep. So some people, the only time they rest is they're trying to get to sleep, and then they're wondering why it takes so long to get to sleep. We need to get our body down off our stress horse. And I think hormesis is great, but if it's already in a body that is so stressed and we've got this cortisol dysregulation, it's not hormesis anymore. It's just an additional stressor that your body and your cortisol response is going to have to deal with. And so I would encourage people to really focus on the nurturing rest and the soft side for a few like very concentrated weeks before they start thinking about, oh, okay, am I in a place to biohack?
I really like that because I think a lot of people are using biohacking because it gives them more energy, it makes them feel good, and a lot of the time for weight loss. I know weight loss is a big piece and we don't have much time to talk about it, but I wondered if you could maybe speak a little bit about that. Doing the softer arts and removing the stress will help you lose that little belly around the middle is what a common.
So if we do have this really active stress response, then what we see is every time that we are having this cortisol response, we have a blood sugar response, and then the body releases insulin. And so there's a few times where people really comment on noticing a belly, and that is a lot of women with PCOS will notice belly fat or back fat suddenly developing, also around perimenopause, and if we are very stressed, and that's all that cortisol insulin response. And so if we are slowing down and allowing the body to rest, like truly rest, and we are exercising, but in a way that we're not stimulating this cortisol response. So strength training is a great option with long rest periods versus long runs, for example, because that's going to kick into your stress response. And also undereating is one of the biggest crimes against humankind. Essentially, if we are not consuming enough energy, our thyroid thinks we're in danger and it's not going to let us lose any weight. And so that's another thing I see is we really need to make sure that we're nourishing ourselves and not depriving ourselves.
I think that's the biggest thing. Our biology is completely different, and medicine is only showing us that now, unfortunately, with all of these symptoms and chronic illnesses that we're experiencing. So we really have to change the game, don't we? What's 3 takeaways that you want our listeners to leave with?
If you have symptoms that are impacting your life, just because a doctor has told you they're normal does not mean that you have to live with them. So if you have something that is impacting your quality of life, you deserve help and to figure out what's going on. Stress is, I feel like a fraud saying it because I've said stress is my biggest weakness. But learning how to manage your stress is one of the most important things for your physical and mental health long term. And consider whether you're feeding your microbiome, because I think often small tweaks can make a really big difference. And if you think about, am I feeding my microbiome? You're also just going to broaden the nutrients that you are coming into contact with as well.
It's a whole, like, another DNA platform inside your body. I just also want to quickly go back to, you've spoken a lot about testing, but I didn't actually dive into that. So someone is, after this conversation, really interested in, okay, I've got these symptoms. Now I'd really like to get some targeted approach to my health and a plan. I'd like to test. What are your favorite tests?
There's a test that I really love that looks at digestive function and microbiome. That's quite comprehensive, and that's from Vivo. There's a test that I'm looking into at the moment, which just looks at your gut wall health and presence of LPS, so those lipopolysaccharides that we talked about that could be inflammatory. And that's from KBMO. And then what I use a lot is looking at the adrenal function as well, and actually what's going on with your cortisol response. So I use the Dutch test quite a lot to look at. And I also just look at comprehensive bloods. So that looks at your thyroid function and nutrient levels and things like that.
So I've got a couple of quick fire femboid questions for you if you're happy to ask, that we have all of our guests answer. So tell me how you live in rhythm.
One of the most important things for me is staying balanced with my food and then focusing on which phase of my cycle I'm in and adding a few little extra bits depending on where I am. So for example, when I'm menstrual, I want lots of really rich iron foods. And when I'm ovulating, I want loads of antioxidants and wonderful things like that.
Wow, that's really powerful. I bet that's been a game changer as well. What do you do on your cheat days, or do you have cheat days? What do you do?
Yeah, I don't love referring to them as cheat days. Essentially, I always say to people, there's food for the body and there's food for the soul, and it's okay to have a little bit of everything. And I treat that with lots of things as well. So, for example, if we're having a completely zone out, mindless Netflix day, that's okay. That might be for the soul and not for the body.
I love that reframe. Thank you. What do you do on those days, maybe if you're experiencing PMS, where everybody and everything is annoying you, and how do you come back to balance?
So I got some really incredible advice from someone I have a lot of respect for, actually, Cam at Blossom Osteopathy. And when I try now and send love to those people. So if I'm feeling really irritable and my fuse is really short, I need love for myself. But more importantly, I need to send love and loving thoughts to those people that I feel have irritated me. So it's about catching my brain at the moment and then changing it to a more positive vibe.
Neuroplasticity, one of the most important things. I love that. And what statement do you use to hype your girlfriend? So if your girlfriends are going through some problems, how do you hype them up?
If I hear my friends speak negatively about themselves, I always say, don't talk about my friend like that. And in terms of a hype phrase, I think it's, do you know the impact that you have on the people around you and how much we all love you?
I love that. And I bet that's changed the reframe for yourself as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we speak so badly to ourselves and about ourselves. So I think that's important to recognize how we speak to our friends, how we should be speaking to ourselves. Lastly, where do you get your motivation from if you're having a bad day, for example?
Oh, that's really tricky. The thing that helps me the most when I'm having a bad day is calling a loved one. Because, we talked about hyping our friends up. Sometimes I need somebody to hype me up. And sometimes if I'm having a bad day and I have a client consult and they tell me about some incredible progress they've made, that is enough to get me completely out of my funk and just realize, yeah, what we're doing is important here.
I think that's really important. The impact that you have, the impact that we can have in our lives, and you're leading the way. Something that terrible happened to you is now life-changing for the better for all of us. So, Marilyanne, thank you so much for your time and the insightful information. Where can our listeners find you? learn more about your work and perhaps have consultation for you and find out about your retreats?
So I'm most active on Instagram, and my handle is @Hormoniously. You can also find lots of information on my website, which is www.hormoniously.com. And that's where you can book in a call with me as well. That if you find me on Instagram and you send me a message, I can point you in the right direction as well. I run consultations over Zoom. I also, most of the lab testing companies have functionality to send abroad as well. So that's really fantastic, actually.
Oh, that's awesome. That's really convenient. I think it's really important if you are in a space where you can get your lab tests, it's a vital sign. So you're not guessing. Test, don't guess. So thank you so much, Marilyanne. It was a pleasure, inspirational. I think these tools can really help. So keep up with what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.